and welcome to Varn Blog. And today I am with Adam and Tish Turl, co-founders of the avant-garde Locus Arts and Letters Collective, and now I guess the people behind the Born Again Labor Museum in Carbondale, Illinois. So what inspired the Born Again Labor Museum?
Do you want to go first, Tish, or?
No, go ahead.
Sure. Well, BALM is based it's an evolving art installation and organizing space. It's a sister project with the Locust Arts and Letters Collective, of which we're a part. But there's also several other people that are a part of Locust and helped found it. And the sort of initial inspiration came over a few things. One, Walter Benjamin's sort of adapting the theological concept of apokatastasis, the redemption of past lost souls, into Marxist cultural criticism, with the sort of idea that the revolutionary generation redeems all past generations of the exploited and oppressed. Thus, the Born Again Labor Museum, the fusing of the Marxist concepts of dead and living labor with evangelical language. We were also really interested in the concept of outsider art's really problematic and messed up in the art world, but we were inspired by a lot of things that are called that in creating like an evolving space that's point isn't the art world, but something else. And then we wanted open a space in geography that would not be likely to make us complicit with gentrification as much contemporary art is, which is one of the reasons we moved back to Illinois, to a relatively small college town in Southern Illinois, to open the space in a strip mall. And so that's sort of like some of the inspiration. A lot of the things we make and the conceptual gestures and artworks in the museum are focused on this idea of trying to bring back aspects of working class history or working class stories, but in a realist way. So rejecting like a sort of just a realist approach to things. And then we've opened up the space to collaborate with other folks, like around folks organizing for reproductive justice, because we're now one of the farthest south areas you can get abortion care for hundreds of miles. Folks from the local YDSA chapter have used the space for organizing and making protest materials. Folks organizing at the local Starbucks, organizing unions and similar things. We also share part of the space with the Carbondale Tool Library, which is a mutual aid project. So,
all right. Well, there's a lot to pick apart there, but I'm going to start off with an assertion that you made that I think is true, but I don't know that my audience has dealt with much. Why is the concept of outsider art so problematic? What does it assume?
Well, if folks, for folks who are familiar with art history and so on, and a lot of people aren't, of course, most people aren't. Most categories of art have a genealogy that's determined by what the artists say about their work or the nature of the work itself. It evolves and argues with itself and with other art movements. And so on, outsider art is categorized almost exclusively by the fact it's not made by initiated people in the quote unquote art world, right? Mm-hmm. So and it's frequently misapplied. For example, Ralph Falsanella is considered an outsider artist or a folk artist and so on. He was a union organizer and a worker in New York City. And he actually organized classes for people in his union at the City College in New York to learn how to be artists. He would spend a lot of his free time when he wasn't organizing unions at various museums in New York. He's literally not self-taught, is my point. So it's a way to categorize things as other for the art world. But one of the things you see in a lot of this work is the people who make it, and I'm not saying their politics are good necessarily, is that they're not focused on talking to the art world itself. They're focused on talking to some other audience. And they have some totalizing view of the world, which has been sort of anathema in the art world for the past few decades after the postmodern turn in art schools and things like that, where even radical political ideas in art have been sort of defanged as, like folks who I don't know if folks are familiar, for example, like situationist art that try to take a conceptual approach to making gestures that would call into question the spectacle of capitalism. that's sort of over time had its radical working class politics taken away from it in the art world and so on. So you sort of just tinker with the signs of oppression, but you don't actually talk about an alternative, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's often incorrect. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, it's often like incorrect. It keeps art unapproachable, which is a thing that I still sometimes struggle with. I mean, I make art with Adam, and I'm not trained, and I still have issues like thinking of myself as an artist because I don't fit the mold. I don't fit the ideology of what that is allegedly supposed to mean, So it keeps people from being artists, I think, when they actually are.
I would agree with that assessment. I think a lot about that because I have an MFA in poetry, and it also functions there to as a separation. Although in the last, say, decade, that separation has kind of fallen apart. Sadly, mostly from market imperatives. There's just not enough of a shared market for us to maintain our snobbery. So how does it put? Actually, to think about this, I'm thinking about my training and how we had all politics crushed out of us. I was not a Marxist yet when I was going through my MFA, but even in literary arts programs, it's highly frowned upon to actually have a totalizing or seemingly ideological point of view. Art, frankly, even to have anything other than an emotive aesthetic kind of. But conversely, there's also, I mean, historically speaking, from my experience, and that's a lot of caveats, there's a lot of hostility the other way with activists and stuff, particularly Marxist activists. Actually, anarchists and even liberal activists don't seem to have this problem, but dealing with art, taking art seriously in the recent past, and that's not historically true, but my experience, like, if you join X Trotskyist or Marxist Leninist group, they're not going to be dealing a whole lot with art. So how is the activist interface, because it's kind of a, I don't want to say a dual use space because you guys clearly conceive it as being wedded together, but how is the other side, the activist side, interfacing with the art? What is, how are they approaching it?
I mean, I think they kind of fuel each other, right? Like, we end up being inspired by people. We also end up wanting to make things that like, inspire people and speak to them, because, like, at least, I know this is true for Adam, but I can only really speak for myself. What I'm trying to make all of the time is like stories about those people, stories about people like me, other working class people. So I want to see them see themselves in it, basically.
Yeah, Tish calls like one of the aspects of their approach to writing, because Tish is also a writer, as sort of class revenge fan fiction. To sort of like imagine a rewriting of the social like in fan fiction, right, where you rewrite, I don't know, something terrible like Harry Potter into something that's not as terrible, or whatever. You reconceive of the narrative and the signs, and so on. I think one of the things for us is, like, obviously art, or I don't know, I don't art can change the world, but it's a human necessity and it's part of like ideological discussion and everything else. So when folks are using the space for actual organizing, they're determining what happens, unlike social practice art, where usually the artist sort of like determines what happens in the social practice art. But one of the reasons we also look to outside art and fan fiction and stuff like that is because what you indicated earlier, we don't want to think our hard-earned BFAs and MFAs and so on turn us basically stalking horses for gentrification or permanent adjuncts or art world dark matter, in the phrase that Gregory Shalat used to describe the sort of army of volunteers and lowly paid or not paid people who make up the quote unquote art world. But that's what we are. So we're better off being with our working class siblings, making art for them and for ourselves, and being a part of the movements and struggles that actually have some kind of impact. And lastly, that the performance around the work is part of the meaning of the work. And I mean performance in the most general way. So if you put up your artwork in a gallery in Boyle Heights that's gentrifying the neighborhood in Los Angeles, that's part of the meaning of your work now. You can't pretend it's not part of your meaning, and so you can't make anti-capitalist, working class, anti-racist work and then put your art in a gallery that's displacing working class Latinx people from their homes. So how do you how do you encourage a performance around your work that isn't that is something else, is what we're trying to get at with but one of the things we're trying to get here.
I think that's a very good point. And thinking about art's role in gentrification and art's role literally often as investment. And the whole, I remember when I was in my MFA program, I was kind of reactionary at the time, but one of the things that I remember feeling pretty adamant about was the absurdity of like anti-capitalist street art being sold to rich people, like going to very expensive presentations of like the Guerrilla Girls work, and that sort of thing, and just being like, this is bizarre. Like, this is so disconnected from any community it is ostensibly speaking about, and actually engaging in the entire process of rendering any benefit to the community aesthetically or logistically as a gentrification element. And that used to really depress me, actually. Like, it was always a downer because it felt like a loser situation. So that's why you chose to put it in a strip mall, right? Yeah.
It's also the only thing we could afford.
Fair point. So this is one of these cases where like practicality and ideology overlap. From the pictures I've seen of it, I have not been to Carbondale, Illinois, so I haven't been there, but it does have a very, I would almost say, multi-generational radical aesthetic. So it reminds me of zines from like the last 30 years, like all at once. So,
thank you.
Yeah. Does that just emerge organically from the community there in Carbondale, or, is that deliberate? Or is it delivered by certain people and not others? What's going on there?
I mean, Carbondale is sort of I'm a transplant, so this is like from a sort of outsider perspective. But Carbondale is like, it's hippies, it's punks. Like, it has the longest continually running punk house in the country. It's like, academics. It's multiracial. There's a huge like LGBT community here, like, and everyone's just sort of like works together. So I think yeah, there's also like a long history of like struggle here. Like, there were student strikes, and so there's a long memory of that. And so yeah, like people, I think, yeah, and Adam is of course like from here, so yeah, I think it's a lot of things knit together, and it's a reflection kind of that. Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that sort of inspired us about like the punk houses, right, is one of the things that accumulates in a punk house is posters for every band that's ever played there and other stuff. And here also, because far right wing punks were gotten rid of a long time ago, also political stuff mixed into it. And I think that's sort of like a differentiated totality, like a mosaic of a bunch of different subjectivities, and that's kind of what we're trying to hit on. as sort of, because you can't really represent like a fully class conscious working class or a future socialist society, because that's an unknowable thing until it happens. It has to be democratically created by the people who do it, and the exploited and oppressed are infinitely variable. So we're trying to reflect that in that kind of mosaic, as well as the sort of like broader culture of that's existed around here, as Tish indicated, historically, and so on. So that's something we're trying to get. It's also something we try to get at in the Locust Review with our co-thinkers around the country and in India, where we're trying to reflect lots of different voices that in aggregate begin to look something like a riot or a mob.
This leads me to another interesting question, and I guess this has to do with the debates about punk's place in politics and its aesthetics. Where do politicized music subcultures kind of seem to be not going away exactly, but they're much more opaque in the days of TikTok and highly streamlined and decontextualized music, and one where local scenes kind of don't exist. So is there something about the Carbondale's what, like a mid-sized city? Maybe a large town.
14,000.
25,000 people live here, but it's the center of like several towns around here, and then there's a university.
So one of the things I've been kind of fascinated with, actually, is the way in which, in so many ways, the mid-sized city has kind of been abandoned in the United States. If you look at crime stats, developmental stats, you just see that all over the place. Like, those are the cities that are really hurting. They're not in the national discourse for whatever reason. I also come from one. I don't live in one now. I live outside of I live in Salt Lake, but I work outside of Salt Lake. But I'm originally from Macon, which is another one of these kind of largest to mid-sized cities in the South. And they're often more, racially, ethnically, and class diverse, and increasingly poor. So increasingly more working class, semi-lumpenized people, etc. So, is there a continuation of the music scene there? Is it something that's kind of maintained by old people? How what's going on there, and how does it interface with that? The fact of these kind of working class Midwestern cities that seem to be not part of the national cultural discourse anymore. I guess that's a lot of questions, but yeah.
I mean, there is a music scene here. Like, there are a number of like bands that are pretty good, and there's a pretty decent music scene here. At least one that is of a size and a quality that I've not experienced anywhere else that I've lived around the same size. That feels sort of unique, I guess. Yeah.
I mean, I think that there is like Pet Mosquito, Fat Jackrabbit,
Right.
and so there's a number of actually pretty good bands here that have a following locally, and there's a sense of there's a sense of, probably because Carbondale is like the life raft town if you're like queer or something in Southern Illinois, and Southern Illinois has been hit hard economically by deindustrialization and closure of the mines and closing of Maytag factories and stuff like that. Just like where Tish is from in Central Illinois. But I think there's also a thing that happened, and that there's a thing that's been happening, to like left discourse and cultural discourse in general with digital media. And I'm not a Luddite, I wouldn't argue to not use digital media. But it encourages this sort of really mediated, hyper-mediated, like discourse that encourages an abstraction from politics. So I was thinking a little bit about I watched some of your old stuff, sort of other videos you did, like when you're talking about like performative anti-imperialism that doesn't actually connect to any actual organizing, stuff like that. And forgive me if I'm making a crude version of your argument. And you see that like with Jody Dean, the media theorist, talking about communicative capitalism, encouraging that kind of abstraction, or the Joseph North book on literary criticism, encouraging sort of a historicism without any action around writing. Like there's no subjectivity either from the point of view of the working class or the oppressed or the writer or the artist. Like, like meaning is defined by the professors at some point. But what is if you're an artist and you want to meet class consciousness or encourage it in your writing or your art or whatever, that's been lost. The stuff that Brecht talked about, or Eisenstein talked about, or Walter Benjamin talked about, or Emory Douglas talked about, the Black Panthers. Like this like idea that the art is an intervention into the world is kind of lost. As a pretense of being outside of those things, right?
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me a lot of, if you read, what is it, The Anti-Revolution of the Word, or by Alfil Reese, or The Programmers, which goes in, I mean, like the OSS, the Proto-CA deliberately starting MFA programs to break up artistic communities. What I find interesting, that doesn't so much happen with music communities until the last 20 years, and it's not complete, it's not thorough. But like, for example, Warner Robins and Macon, two probably similar size sounds to Carbondale, a little larger, had pretty vibrant interracial, multiracial music communities, and you could find an all ages concert there at least once a month until the early aughts. If you go back there now, it is very hard to find bands and whatnot who are still playing. There's no venues. Most of the old the venues have either been gentrified to be too expensive, or they've been let to rot, and it's kind of dangerous to go there. And there's no in between. And I think a lot of people get their entertainment and like in this digital way. And I've often, not just on like performative anti-imperialism. And yeah, you didn't mischaracterize my argument, but also on things like I've wanted to do, for example, stuff about political stuff going on in Utah, but the way my audience is dispersed, it actually doesn't make that much logistic sense, because there's only like maybe 100 people locally that listen to it out of like the 4,000 on average that might see this in the course of 2 months on 2 different platforms, and then when I look at where my actual downloads are from, it's like New York, London, and then scattered kind of randomly throughout the US and Canada. And it's like, it's very hard to build any kind of community or discourse about that and talk concrete politics. I mean, I get pushback on talking about concrete politics sometimes just about limiting it to the United States, and fair enough. I mean, if I'm from the rest of the world, I get sick hearing about us too. But thinking about that also in terms of like, well, where does someone go? There's like a gap now. And it seems like something like the Born Again Labor Museum actually does, as a space, kind of try to recapitulate something like that need. It's not the same thing as, but in some ways, since it's explicitly trying to incorporate the political, it might be a little better. I remember in the aughts, when I was in my 20s, I felt like the punk scene pretty actively depoliticized for a little while. So, it was, it didn't have the same kind of effects. Whereas like in the 90s, and, I'm going to sound like an old right now, but like there was just a plethora of like Xerox zines that you could get into. And a lot of them have very radical ideas. And a lot of my first exposure to a lot of the ideas that I would later encounter in graduate school are more developed in political circles. I encountered in zines, which admittedly you might go, well, there's blogs for that now, or TikTok or whatever. But the thing about the zines where they were embedded in my immediate community. They were about Georgia or about the Southeast. They were not in generally like the entire world in just an abstract. So
I mean, yeah, the physicality is something that's really important to us, like both in Locust and in BALM. And that's kind of like that's a thing that because I used to rationalize, at least, especially when I was stuck in a tiny Midwestern town that, sucked and was dead. Like, it's a Band-Aid though. And it's a Band-Aid that actually ends up preventing the wound from healing, because the wound is that there's something very, very wrong. And the only way to actually fix it is to, in your immediate area, start to fix it. The reason that fixing the world seems such a big thing is because we're looking at the whole world, when that's not really the thing that we can actually fix, like individually, right? We have to start by building a community and doing what we're able in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, many years ago, I used to be, you mentioned sex. One of the sects I've been in was the ISO. I left, more than a decade ago. The International Socialist Organization, which was a Cliffite third campus type thing. That's not important, but the guy, Tony Cliff, was one of the founders of that tendency. He used to tell a funny joke about being sent to Ireland to help organize the leadership of the Fourth International in Ireland. And it was two guys in a room with a swivel chair, right? And they've been issuing proclamations as if they were like some working class army. Now, I'm not saying that's what we're all doing now, right? And I write things and I put them on the internet, and we have a podcast at Locust Review and so on. And those large political discussions are important. And of course, I want people to see our artwork and read our stories. And people do get Locust Review around the country and in Europe and in parts of Asia and so on. But I'm a Marxist. I feel like you have to be with, the subject of Marxism, which is the working class and the oppressed, in real life every day, in some way. And it doesn't mean that you show up in front of the factory and tell people what they should be doing or whatever, but you help out the movements you can, and you try to encourage other people that are organizing people in real life, try to contribute what knowledge you have to people in actual physical spaces where you are. And I think what happens is, we learn some Marxism and so on, or some politics and so on. And it's easy to get separated out, from that, being with that subject. And again, I'm not a Luddite or anything, but the way the digital media is set up particularly social media, tends to encourage right-wing politics and make it difficult for left-wing politics to find fruition, because left-wing politics require activating people into some kind of self-activity, whereas right-wing politics don't need to activate people in that same critical, conscious way. They just have to spread the good news of hate, So I think being with people in real life is an important antidote to being separated out, if that makes sense. Just having the conversation up here rather than from below or whatever.
Yeah, that reminds me of a kind of a dark anecdote, but I'll tell it. Yeah, leaderless resistance was originally a Marxist resistance strategy developed in Latin America in the 1950s and 60s. It was kind of abandoned because it's really only good for one thing, and it's not the leaderless part; it's the totally self-activated part of it. It's good for terror cells, and weirdly, that was realized, by white nationalists in the 1970s who didn't adopt the strategy. And I see that, not that trolling is the same as, randomly killing people. It's not. That's not what I'm saying. But that same kind of logic seems to be the case with trolling, where like causing chaos in a way that actually helps the status quo is something you can do as an individual.
Mm-hmm.
It's negative, it's right wing, but you can do it as an individual. You don't need a group. You don't need to feel the part of anything. In fact, it's probably better if you're not, from the standpoint of being a destructive right wing twirl or a terrorist or whatever. The left will often flirt with these kinds of things. It just doesn't work for us because it's not solidaristic enough. It's not concrete enough, and it doesn't put you in community with any subject in any real way. And I think that's interesting, and it reminds me of why, you know, I'm also one of these people who would just repeat art isn't going to change the world, but that why artistic communities were actually important enough for, say, I don't know, the U.S. intelligence service to want to break them up. Like, so one of the things I think BALM has done that's really interesting is you've been able to support local Starbucks workers who are, have they finished organizing, or they're still on the road to getting their union established? What's going on with that?
I mean, yeah, they've unionized. They just had a strike here that they Red Cup Day, they ended up shutting the store down, I think 4 or 5 hours early. So and they were turning customers away left and right. So yeah, they're well in the way. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. They're getting resistance on, like, all the Starbucks are on
right.
The company negotiating in good faith, quote unquote. Because I guess the company's showing up and walking out within like 5 minutes, you know, so they can say they showed up, but they're not actually negotiating. You know, so we had a strike. We went out there with some of the workers. It was 4:20 in the morning because the manager got there at 4:30. So, and I'm 12 years old inside my head. That's why I'm laughing at the number 420. But yeah, and we had tons of people out. People brought a cardboard cutout of Mother Jones. Yeah, so and they had to shut it down early because they couldn't keep staffing. It was great. So, I mean, basically, the workers just used BALM, you know, a few times when they were organizing because, one, it was nearby the Starbucks, and then BALM was part of organizing with some of the left groups here, like Labor Day Barbecue with the Starbucks workers and stuff like that. Of course, we share their fundraisers because they're targeting some of the workers. But they were successful. They won their union vote.
Yeah,
that's great to hear. One thing that strikes me that, like, a deliberately politicized art space that is not sectarian can do, though, is put different groups in contact with each other. But a place like Salt Lake, we actually have a few different groups. We have the United Panthers movement. There's the PSL. There's all the local unions. There's La Red de Solidaridad, and there's DSA, but they don't interface. They don't intersect and coordinate very much. They actually often are in completely different parts of town. The only time I've ever really seen them together was during the George Floyd protests, insurrection, revolt. I'll give it a lot of names, but there isn't a lot of coordinating between them, and often, actually, because there's no shared social spaces, when they do coordinate, if it's not explicitly political, it's quite awkward. For example, the United Panthers and the Brown Berets are here on the west side of town, which is mostly Latin, and the DSA is often on the east side of town, which is mostly pale. And when they have tried to interface before, and it was actually pretty much explicitly from the DSA side, and I'm not saying this to crap on the DSA, but they didn't really know how to deal with, like, a working class Latin barbecue. And it was from lack of exposure. I mean, but it was like it was marked and obvious and telling. And it's interesting because just having a space where people could be around each other more would probably reduce a lot of that. I mean, it's very simple.
Yeah. I think we have DSA chapter here, a YDSA chapter, various unaffiliated Maoists and Trotskyists, and there is a PSL thing, but it's not very big at this point. And a lot of anarchists and anarcho-syndicalists, but mostly people get along most of the time, and then other people who are, queer activists and so on. In fact, one of our friends who's an anarchist works at a community, a space that helps people like get connected to like public services and so on if they can't. And they've got a picture of Mao behind them, even though they're an anarchist, because they want to weed out the moralists when they come to their office. So
that is a way to do it.
An anarchist who's got a picture of Mao behind them just to like, Anyway, so I mean, I think there's real political arguments and so on that are worth having, but they're supposed to be had out in the course of organizing together real things, right? Right now. And, I'm come from a Leninist, Trotskyist background. Initially, I'm not orthodox about any of it, or even orthodox or whatever. But I will say sometimes some groups trip over their own feet, like by like being so democratic centralist, they cover up, sexual assault or harassment. That's been a problem with certain groups on the left, or assuming that because they've read a certain number of books because they got a chance to go to college that they know more than other people. That really hurts you when you're organizing working class people. And I remember once a young comrade asking like, what's going on in Cuba right now? And then this other comrade gives this like 20-minute explanation of her class analysis of Cuba based on the orthodoxy of her organization. And then the other comrade said, this 18-year-old comrade said, I just wanted to know like what was actually literally happening this week. I know all the shit you just said. And anyway, sorry, I don't mean to rant or whatever.
No, but it's a good rant to have, because even if one is a sectarian, it helps be able to communicate with other people.
It's like, yeah, I've read all those books. I just wanted to know what happened this week.
Right, exactly. Like, that's an interesting problem, and it's one that I think, again, in-person exposure can help you do, because one of the things about the performativity of online spaces and is they encourage ego bombing, right? Mm-hmm. Like they just do. It's part of their, I think they're designed to, honestly. I haven't found the smoking gun on that in the way we found with like making you addicted to your own dopamine, but it does feel like that we know that they're designed to increase engagement through negative interaction, and thus ego dumping is a good way to ensure negative interaction. So I suspect that's part of what's going on there. And in-person interaction doesn't. I mean, for two reasons. One, you actually have the possibility of real relationships with people in a positive sense. And two, in physical spaces, someone can punch you. Like, not that we should encourage punching, but right. It is always there. So people behave more solidaristically. Mm-hmm. I think more actually because from the former, from the positive interaction. But I have often thought like you would never act like you see the way some people talk to each other online. Even the worst, most jerky academics would probably not do that in person. Mm-hmm. So,
sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think one of the things is how social media is structured is that everybody's their own individual avatar struggling for attention, and there's completely decontextualized. So the Horatio Alger myth is sort of hardwired into it. You're like my avatar will rise to the top of the avatars and become important and so on. And one of the things like we've tried to do with the space, like Tish, for example, designed this tabletop RPG called Paranoid Androids, where you're either a robot, a cyborg, or a human working at a gas station in this dystopian capitalist hellscape city in the future. And you end up basically tying up your boss and burning down the gas station, and then you have to like navigate what to do collectively as a group of gas station workers who are in the future. And we played this together with a whole bunch of different comrades at a Halloween party, raising money for mutual aid for Surgeon, the Southern Illinois Reproductive Justice Network. I don't know if you want to talk about that, but I think it's sort of like you're literally collaboratively trying to like discuss what a revolution would look like, but in this a real way. So it's not like you're not fighting over like Kronstadt or something. You're actually like, talking about, should we kill the regional manager? Never mind, I shouldn't have said that. But
yeah, the whole point was to have two decisions. One, everyone had to decide how they wanted to move forward with the growing revolution around them, and two, everyone had to decide how they were going to handle the end of the world together. Like, it had to be a vote, it had to be collectively achieved. I really wanted to, because that moment is something that I'm really fascinated with. The moment where it's like, it's too much, not to quote Howard Beale too much, but when you're mad as hell and you can't take it anymore, that moment is something that I'm like constantly trying to write. Yeah.
So that, man, you actually are kind of speaking my language, because those are like three different obsessions. You've hit art, you've hit politics, and you've hit my weird penchant for tabletop RPGs as a way to model human interaction in a useful way, which unfortunately I feel like has kind of thank you Hasbro chased out of a lot of current RPGs. As much as I actually like Fed D&D, but it's not a game for that. What are the things, and man, every time I say this, people think I'm conservative, but I actually mean this in a radical way. Literature and gaming is a way to start to form both responses on what you think your social character should be, like how you should interact with people, what decision, like what are your decisions actually if you got to test it. And I do think Adam has a point that, like, most discussions about this on the left, if I hear another fucking argument about Kronstadt, I swear to God, it's a way to feel like you're talking about something and not talk about anything at all, because we have 1,000 ready-made narratives we can just adopt about that. It doesn't actually solve the problem of what happened in that particular moment. I mean, and then the bigger question is, and your moment won't look like that. Like, if it happens, it will not be the same as 1917 and to 1920 to 1921. We don't live in that world. We got drones, for one thing, a whole different panoply of problems. Climate change is a lot more real. I mean, there's all kinds of things that change that. I'd rather talk about that now. And a game is a nice way to kind of softly and socially manipulate people into doing that.
My dream. Yeah.
And it's not just like a one-way street, like you using these art, literature, games, and so on as propaganda, or as interventions into the political unconscious. It's also that interacting with comrades and workers with the artwork makes the artwork better. Because one of the things that's made contemporary, like visual art, so, to borrow from Boris Groys, weak, sort of avoiding strong images and strong politics, is because it's made for a very select group of intellectuals and rich people. And so it doesn't end up expressing much of the human stuff. There's this poem by Amira Baraka, who called The Politics of Rich Painters, which is one of my favorite poems, where he talks about like their fingerprints on glass being enough for an effective ruling on humanity, and also commerce. And that's what you end up getting. And it's not that I don't like expressionistic stuff. I really do. I love a lot of expressionism and abstract painting and so on. But if it's just that and only rich people get to see it, it's a rarefied, it's not really expressing anything of interest to me. It's not very good art at this particular moment, I think. Whereas stuff that tries to connect, like, what do you do? And you're a robot that makes hamburgers right after you've kidnapped your boss at the gas station. resonates really well with people. Like,
Yeah.
which was what happened when we played Tish made. Like the guy who was playing the robot that made hamburgers just kept making hamburgers of people. Anyway, sorry.
He literally ate the rich.
Yeah, he literally made hamburgers of the rich.
Sorry.
No need to apologize. Everybody likes a good revenge fantasy. What I would, I think it's important to point that out. Actually, that it's not people like somewhat of that. I've been talked about, like people talk to me about the politics of my own art, and I always I don't deliberately put it there because I don't want it to be didactic. It's there, but it's got to be pulled out by a community, because otherwise it's just me telling you what to do, and you got enough people in your life telling you what to do.
Mm-hmm.
It needs to be something for people to make something of it. And if we're gonna talk bullshit about the death of the author and discourse communities or whatever, we might as well make that actually mean something, as opposed to discourse communities being whatever the graduate school class decided the French word meant. So I'm definitely with you on that. This is actually speaking to years of MFA trauma.
Like, which French word? I'll have to ask Tish which French word, because Tish actually knows some French. I don't really. My French is terrible.
But I think it's also good in other ways, because there's a certain amount of there's a kind of leftist reactionary politics that treats workers as inherently unsophisticated, barely not conservative troglodytes that really offends me, because the people around me were were working class, and they were real wed. They weren't stupid. Now I realize that that's rare. It's rare because of the conditions the working class is put under, but it's not because of any inherent lack of intellectualism of the working class inherently. And yet a lot of people seem to think it is. And I think sometimes even things as simple as role-playing games illustrate that that's not true. So I think that's really important for people to see. And yeah, when we say it like this, it seems obvious, but then well, look at how people interact with people, though. It's apparently it's not actually all that obvious. Snobbery abounds. And I also think we were talking about expressionism. The idea that difficult art is also not liked by uneducated, by quote uneducated or working class people, unquote, just seems to me ludicrous. That's actually not remotely true.
Yeah, the mass constituency for banality is the middle class,
right? I mean,
not the working class.
That's everybody who wants to Yeah, I used to talk about that being you have a job that keeps your brain on just enough that you want sugar at the end of the day, so you go watch a Marvel movie, because it has and there are good Marvel movies for there are good forms of candy. It's not all bad, but you don't want to just eat that,
right.
I also you got the live laugh bumper sticker on your SUV as you yell at the Starbucks worker for getting your frap of whatever the hell wrong, but and again it's I totally agree with you. There is this talking down thing that happens to working class people that's really weird to me, because some of the most brilliant people I've known have been working class, and some of the least sophisticated thinkers I've known have been very well educated. And there's no reason to dumb things down, either in artwork or in political discourse and so on. There's also no reason to try to sound fancy either when you're saying something simple, or overcomplicate things, the way sometimes happens also. There's sort of an obsession going on with some old comrades I know with Hegel, And it's not that I don't think that that might be important or whatever, but it's almost like I think they're trying to like create a perfect philosophical worldview to fall back on because the world has disappointed them.
Yeah, this is sort of an issue that I have. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
It's just it kind of gets it like an issue because I don't have like a huge background in theory. I radicalized by having a shit job and growing up in a town where a factory shut down and kind of slowly reading bits and pieces and just realizing that everything is awful. And every time I've tried to like enter into quote unquote theoretical leftist spaces, like especially things on like Facebook, it just ends up being an echo chamber wherein I can't actually say anything. I at one point I was like, I tried to join a discussion that seemed like it was going well, and I was like, look, I have I don't trust what the United States tells me about China, nor do I trust what China tells me about China, but like I'd like to get some information on like where I can read about what is actually going on in China ideologically, etc. And I was called a xenophobe and an ignorant redneck. Like, and I mean, maybe I'm a redneck. I grew up on a goat farm, but like, that's not helpful. This is the same thing that like keeps happening to people, right? And yeah,
How very uncultural revolutionist of them. No,
yeah, because if there was a Maoist revolution, Tish would be taking them out to the countryside to like learn.
Yeah, no, for real. I mean, the hickification of urban intellectuals like was a big part of Mao's program. But yeah, I mean, and you're right. Part of that to me is like there's a huge, with China in particular, like there's a huge knowledge gap, and elites are not telling you the truth on it, but that's true from kind of both sides actually.
right.
And you kind of have to know Mandarin or know someone who knows Mandarin, and know someone from China to even begin who is, not also not a reactionary, because like, so there's like 1,000 barriers there, and
Right.
I feel like people are calling you a xenophobe because, well, everyone's talking out of their ass.
Yeah.
To put it a little bit crudely. I remember one time I said something about getting a gauge of Xi Jinping's popularity in China and what it really was, and talking about like the rural reforms that were finally done under him and the complications with that, but that it actually made him popular. And somebody on Twitter was like, well, you're in America, man. Like, why don't you just care about your own healthcare? And this was a leftist. And I'm like, one, internationalism. Two, I lived in Asia for a long time, actually. So like, it's like kind of personal for me. No, I didn't live in China, but and I, similarly, I was like, I just want to get a feel for what people actually think and feel, and I'm not getting that, particularly also from like the conservative or liberal mainstream press. Like the bourgeois press is definitely got a line on this, and and then the counter examples I see also seem like to be transparently aligned. So it's like, well, where am I going to find actual information? And it's quite difficult.
And you got the least generous possible reading of what you said.
Oh yeah. And again, in person, there are still ungenerous assholes. I'm not, we're not going to pretend that's not the case, but it does seem to go down a little bit. Wonder why that is. But
well, there's also sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, there's also like the class distort. Like most working class people are on the internet in the United States at this point, but the amount of time that people spend on the internet goes down by class, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like half of young people are on TikTok, but that tends to mostly be younger middle class people, not most working class. And if the young working class people are on TikTok, they check out every now and then. Obviously there's always exceptions and so on, but there's class distortions in usage, like who's on there the most. And there's even bigger class distortions in who produces quote unquote content, right? Now there's always exceptions. There's good socialist content and so on. But the tendency is most content is produced by people who have, of course, the means and the time to make it, right? So that's going to skew also by class. So there, so there's the actual structure of it, the ideology of the people who made it, but there's also the class biases that filter into it as well. And so the angry sort of like least generous reading of things, it's like it's really been encouraged. And then you have the added problem of decontextualization with Poe's law, right? Like, so people like will misunderstand what you said because there's no context, right? Like, I'll stop talking, but like and that's another reason why it's so important to do stuff in real life. Like we have to use these tools because there's not going to be a mass socialist movement in the United States that refuses to use computers. But there's also not going to be a mass socialist movement if we don't get together with people in real life, and do the stuff that,
Yeah, actually, this is a good pivot, and we should bring it back to what you guys are attempting. I think a lot about this concept of translocalism, because the localism of the 70s to the 90s was kind of a cul-de-sac we got stuck in. But it also seems like when we woke up from that and we were all like national politics all the time, it led to a problem. And one of the critiques I had of the Bernie movement, I know, and it was not a critique of Bernie or anything like that, but people had a hard time hearing it, was that we had not built local political bases for it. We had a national base and it was quite big, but like there was no infrastructure, no para institutions, and by that I mean like informal institutions for us to rely on. Our formal ones, we hadn't really got all the unions on board. We really didn't have any way to like amp up local politicians to like coordinate with Bernie. It was all assumed it was just going to happen if Bernie won the executive office, which I was like, that's not how politics works. And it seemed to me like a lot of people had, I would say, learned a lesson, but let's be honest, also, like a lot of these people aren't old enough to have learned the lessons of the 90s. Like I was a teenager, and I'm in my 40s now. So, but they've heard about the failures of the 70s through the 90s and their localism. So the idea is that we just flipped it to nationalism. And the other problem with that is that it views things as a national problem where some of our problems are actually international problems. And weirdly approaching it as coordinated locals, it's actually easier to do internationally than like getting an entire nation to agree with another entire nation. And I think doing it through art or something seemingly cultural or soft, I try to do it through education, for example. Like this is the aim of this channel is edutainment, but I'm only accidentally funny. So if I lean on the tainment side, it's mostly by incompetence. But it's an educational channel, and it's meant to bring different elements together and not necessarily say, this is the right way to do everything. Art makes that a lot easier than like ideological screaming matches. So
part of it, good art always has to be somewhat indeterminate, right? Like, and Tish has been talking a lot about this with Keats.
Negative capability.
Like living with things that are unfinished. You can't really make art, write a story, make a painting, a sculpture, a conceptual art thing if you feel like it must be resolved, because it's never turns out the way you want it to, really. There was that artist King or whatever her name was who said that process is what saves you from the poverty of your own expectations, so it's living with indeterminacy is like part of art, what we want is everybody who's a radical leftist and everybody who's working class, and especially where that overlaps, to like look at our work and be a part of it, and work with us. We also go to the organizing meetings when we can and try to help actually do stuff. We're not like, because we're just, we make art and write stories, but we're just regular people too. Like, also, I hate the phrase regular people. It drives me nuts because nobody's actually regular. I mean, I guess maybe there could be people who go to the bathroom at the right time. I don't know, but anyway. But Tish, you could talk more about the indeterminacy or whatever. But
yeah, I mean that just sort of, that's been a thing that also, like, reading about that and hearing about that from my romanticism teacher, I was like, that gets it. Something that frustrates me about the left is that every little thing, it has to be figured out. Like, we have to build the perfect structure of philosophy and ideology, and only then will we be able to move forward. And it's like, no, you actually have to do the moving forward and figure things out that way. Like, obviously, that's how you do anything. And I say that now because I struggled with that myself, like in my own writing, and it can be really, like, well, freezing. It can just stop you. But yeah, you have to. That's a thing that just drives me nuts. You have to be able to live with the uncertainties of what's gonna happen and what will be the results of what you do. Because if you don't, you're never actually going to do anything, especially nothing of value.
yeah, it's also weirdly not Marxist coming from Marxists, right? We have to work out the ideas first, and then everything will work. It's not materialist.
Oh yeah, that the idea that we're gonna engineer the perfect ideology to then have the revolution confuses me too. I think about the theses on Feuerbach in the end as like, the purpose is not just to understand the world, but to change it, and then later on you realize the purpose of that is like, oh, because as we're changing the world, our understanding must necessarily change with it, meaning that we can't really preemptively do anything. We can't preemptively know everything that's going to come up, and we shouldn't try to. And in fact, in trying to, we're probably dooming everything.
It creates like a passivity. Like, there's that old joke about how many Trotskyists it take to screw in a light bulb, and the answer is none. They just wait for objective conditions to change it. And I grew up in Trotskyist stuff, so I don't dislike Trotsky. I'm not like a Stalinist ice pick person or whatever, but there is truth to that joke.
Well, yeah, I actually used to have debates with Douglas Lean about this when I would talk about like Marxist eschatology, where I was like, well, we're trying to get every tittle right, so and trying to get every little bit right, we're not doing anything, and then our answer to that is like, well, capitalism will inevitably, through its own contradictions, make the objective conditions for socialism happen, and I've always been like, if that's Marxism, that's the one part I don't accept, because it does seem like we actually have to do something.
Right. Like Marx did, and Lenin did, and Trotsky did. And you might not agree with them. Mao actually did something, whether you agree with it or not. So it's weird to have this like anti-voluntarism, like as if the point of a theory isn't practice of some kind.
Yeah.
Sometimes I remember growing frustrated with some comrades with like, man, you're more abstract than like art theorists, because at least art theorists think you should make art. like you're more abstract than some of the bougiest abstract academics that ever existed, because they think you should at least make something happen.
Yeah, ouch.
I'm not nobody in particular.
Yeah. No. I don't feel called out, but I have definitely seen it. Yeah, it's I think ironically, if you're doing something that's all interface and avatar, and I mean, at best, social media is an intellectual game primarily, and that's if we're being generous to anything, and that's one that I think people need to be. I guess it's finally getting through people's thick skulls that since 2010 this has been so heavily algorithmized that like people are messing with your mood and your processing, and there's a reason why Facebook isn't as pleasant as it was 10-12 years ago, and also doesn't work as well, but just in general, even for what he wants to do. But I think that's, I don't know, part of me, one of the things when I was reading about BALM that really did speak to me, I was like, oh, okay, this is like zine culture plus. Like, we're doing something with it. There's an actual space. You can bring in these parts of life, because one of the things that I have like talked to people about like organizing, I was like, well, organizers often over rely on students because students have a lot of excess time. And then you after that you rely on like the upper middle class because they have excess time or excess money. And to some degree you're not going to get away from that, and if you're from those classes, you're not automatically bad people, but you are excluding systemically literally the people that you're talking about. And if all you offer someone as a political organization or as political movement is political education, and then go to canvas for someone and nothing social and not a whole lot of other tangible benefits, that's a hard ask for working class people. That's a real hard ask. And honestly, it's not a rational ask.
No.
The
whole point of like Marxism was that you would organize workers by meeting their material needs, not by asking them to deny their material needs to build a propaganda group that will later on do something, right? Like it's weird to ask working class people to spend all their time. And I literally saw this, like telling working class people, well, we need you to do a paper sale at the fancy bougie school so we can recruit some more students. And to complete disconnect from like actual Marxism there. Anyway, sorry.
No, I think that's a fair point, which is why this art stuff is important, because not only does it get people interacting with various stratums of the broad working class, right? So, we're not just dealing with middle class wage earners anymore, the quote PMC or whatever. I hate that phrase, but I'll grant it for people who complain about that on the left. But you're also not just asking people to give up stuff and get very little out of it, because people will engage in art because it edifies them. People engage in role-playing games because it's something to do. If they can tie that into something meaningful, and something meaningfully political, all the better. And people will be all about that. But I mean, you can't protest all the time. Like, you got to do more than that. And I think what's interesting is historically, actually, something like BALM was common in like the German workers' movement of the 19th and early 20th century. They totally were common. Like salons, socialists had like soccer teams. I mean, like none of that was considered frivolous. It was considered important, since you were asking people to give up stuff beyond, if nothing else, their time, beyond their work. You needed to make it interesting.
And also meet the needs, which are like, bread and roses, right? There's a very American and puritanical aspect to sect organizing in the U.S. that makes it difficult to organize with workers, but everything you're doing is for the future revolution and the emancipation of all humanity. Well, then you can't really say, well, I need to take it easy tonight, right? Because the future of humanity is on the line. Whereas actually taking it easy tonight is the thing that helps liberate the humanity in the future. When you're doing it with your fellow working class siblings, because there's not supposed to be any difference between our interests now and our future interests, right? There might be sectional differences and so on that we have to work out and have solidarity around and stuff like that. But pleasure and enjoying life, that's one of the motivating factors for escaping this system. And like you said, in German social democracy in the late 1800s, early 1900s, also in working class neighborhoods in Paris in the 1800s, art and poetry were a big part of like working class rebellion, and all over. Well, sorry, I've got a cat right now. He's demanding pets.
I understand.
He's a communist.
Yeah, pets are commies until you give them their food. But then they're commies again when they see your food. So, and you gotta love that about them. Thank you guys for coming on. This has been a great discussion. What's coming up for the Born Again Labor Museum, and anything else you'd like my audience to know about?
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll go ahead. We don't have anything super planned at this moment. We'll probably do some events early in the new year. We did a Halloween party, like we said, to raise money for the Reproductive Justice Network. YDSA frequently uses our space for movie nights. We've had concerts and so on to raise money for like the Defend the Atlanta Forest stuff. So it'll be more stuff like that. But this is a town where the two main industries are healthcare and the university is about to wrap everything up. There'll be like 1 week of regular class after the break, and then finals, and then everything will like go on hiatus except for the hospital, pretty much for a month. So we'll probably early next year start organizing stuff again, but nothing right at the moment. Although we'll have to keep defending the Starbucks workers because we don't know what management's going to do next there. There also might be a strike at the grade school. Possibly there's some union contract negotiation shenanigans. And then I think the 4 unions at the university have contracts coming up next. So next year might be really busy actually, with all the different contracts coming up. So, and also the far right's starting to come into town more now that the election's over, trying to save the fetuses and attack women getting abortions.
Yeah, there's a $50K a year job to hold a sign out in front of a building that provides health care to people who are terrified and can't get it in their own states. So yeah, they're starting to push on that issue here more. So I'm sure we'll have something to do in that regard.
Yeah, no, they're paying more than one person $50,000 a year to stand in front of the abortion clinic, which is actually a full reproductive rights clinic eventually, and gender affirming care clinic that they're protesting for Jesus, they say.
Fun.
But nothing really happens here in December.
Fair enough, actually. Well, best of luck to you. I want to keep you guys pegged, and I'll probably check back in a few months to see how it's going out there in Illinois. And I just got off about 2 days ago doing a long-ish interview over the University of California academic workers strike, which right now is the largest strike in the United States, I think. It's 50K strong. And what they were asking for seemed pretty reasonable, and they can't even get the university to give them a raise pegged to inflation, much less enough for them to actually live any distance to near where they work. So
They gave the tenured there's 4 unions at the university in this town. They gave the tenured faculty a 2% pay raise, and they were feeling guilty because nobody else got anything. I'm like, no, what you got is a smaller pay cut. You understand that, right? You got a 6 or 7% pay cut instead of the 8 or 9% pay cut everybody else got. But I think that's something about like because we had a huge strike here in 2011, and there's been some people have gotten beaten down a little bit in terms of what they think they can do right now. So hopefully the folks at University of California win. That would help.
Yeah,
that would help the rest of us a lot, I think.
Yeah, well, let's hope so. We'll probably know in January, actually, how well they ended up doing. So, hope you guys have a good night, and thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having
thank you
us.
for having us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.